It's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Liberal Democrat MP Daisy Cooper, broadcaster Richard Madeley, Conservative MP Tom Hunt, and the Chief Executive of the cross-party think tank Demos, Polly Mackenzie. Today,
we've got to try and fix it as fast as we can, make sure that we have the supplies that we want, make sure that we don't allow the companies we rely on to go under.
The government holds crisis talks with energy companies as gas prices spike. The Liberal Democrat leader isn't impressed.
From farms to factories, from an energy crisis to a food crisis. Thanks to the Conservatives, our country is hurtling towards a cliff edge.
This Labour MP says she won't go to Labour conference this year because of the abuse she's received.
The kind of levels of vitriol and it's pretty horrible, and I don't feel that I wanted to go through that, to be honest.
And did the toxic political culture in the US begin with 9/11?
So much of our politics has become a naked appeal to anger, fear, and resentment. That leaves us worried about our nation and our future together.
So you heard Boris Johnson there in the headlines responding to questions about surging price of wholesale gas and pressure on a number of energy companies as some struggle to stay afloat. Crisis talks are going on as we speak. Let's take a look at the front pages and how they are covering the story. Energy groups seek emergency support to weather gas crisis. This is how The Guardian has written it up. Emergency talks in bid to contain fallout from surge in gas prices. And finally, on the front page of the Metro, crisis, what crisis? My opening question to everybody on the show today is, should more of us have seen this coming? Have we all been taken by surprise, Daisy?
Well, the government definitely should have seen this coming because price rises have been increasing from the start of August. And at that point, that's when the government decided that actually they were going to raise the price cap. The fact is, this is coming at absolutely the worst time for millions of very vulnerable consumers. They are facing a cut in their universal credit of £20 a week. They are having tax rises through national insurance, and household bills are now soaring. So the government must step in to protect these incredibly vulnerable consumers.
But my question was, were you taken by surprise by how this is unfolding so quickly?
I was taken by surprise by how quickly it's unfolded, but the government shouldn't have, because the government 2 years ago had energy companies that collapsed. It said it was going to step in and change the way that these companies were regulated. Again, last week, companies were collapsing for the very same reasons that the government has been asleep at the wheel for months and months and months. All
right, Tom, what about you? Should the government, should more of us have seen this coming, this surge in wholesale gas prices? That it could lead to shortages?
Well, of course, it's very easy to say with hindsight we should have seen it coming. But of course, we know that because of the government is grappling with all sorts of incredibly complex issues at the moment. So, I mean, I didn't see it coming. To be honest, I'm not sure what many countries in the world saw it coming. This isn't just an issue impacting us. It's an issue impacting virtually every other country in the world. What is reassuring is that the business sector and the Prime Minister are on top of it. Does seem to me to very much be a short-term issue. There are other issues to do with the energy sector and to do with prices that need to be addressed as well. And I wouldn't say I don't have concerns about how this could impact some of my constituents, but I think this those very quite unique things that has come about largely because of a pandemic and the pressures it's put on the system.
Do you agree with that, Polly? Is it unique in the way Tom has outlined, or should the government and more of us seen it coming?
Well, the crisis unravelling over the last few days seems to be an acute problem. And, as Tom says, it's easy to think about hindsight. What we need to consider is the kind of broad approach that we've taken to energy companies and encouraging market entry, encouraging diversity and competition in this sector, I think we probably haven't taken seriously enough the extent to which we needed to stress test that approach. There's a lot of correlations with what happened in 2008 in the financial services system, that essentially an acute shock caused all sorts of systemic problems. And by bringing lots of into the market with slightly lower regulation for those new providers means that the prices they can offer are slightly lower. Can't then just roll those companies over into the bigger suppliers without spreading the contagion, exactly as happened in financial services. 2008. So I think what we're seeing here is a shock that was bigger than what might have been forecast, and that actually calls into question the structure of the energy market in the UK we've very proactively designed.
Richard, where are you? I'm just going to, before you answer, remind people of what the Prime Minister suggested. Like everybody going back to put the kettle on at the end of a TV programme, you're seeing huge stresses on the world supply. But to some extent, we have known, haven't we, to continue the metaphor, that the end of the TV programme is coming for some time. Yeah. So in your mind, where do you think this lies in terms of who's surprised and why?
Well, speaking of basically as a reporter, I suppose, is what I am. I certainly didn't see this story coming. I wouldn't have written a sort of a prediction of it 2 weeks ago, even 10 days ago, maybe even a week ago. I mean, it's a pretty new event. I kind of go along with what Tom said. I mean, I wouldn't use the kettle analogy, but I do think that it's what you would define as a perfect storm. I think there are so many factors involved here, and they've all come together at the same time. And that being the case, a lot of those factors will start to fall away, and we'll probably get through it. But I certainly think that we are going to have to bail out the firms concerned, because we simply can't have them going bust, because people won't get the power.
All right. Well, as I said, there is an emergency meeting, crisis talks ongoing. Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary, is hosting those talks. Let's find out what the options actually are available in terms of what the government can do. Simon Jack is the BBC's business editor. Simon, what is on the table for the government to do at this point? And, of course, isn't just about heating our homes.
No. Well, the options, in normal circumstances, what would happen when an energy company that goes bust, and they do from time to time, is that you go to one of the big suppliers and you ask them to take on the customers of the company that's gone bust. Now, they do not want to do that at the moment, because such has been the spike in prices. For them to honour the promises that made by the company going bust, cost them hundreds of pounds per customer. You're talking about millions of customers, so you're talking about millions, billions of pounds that they would be in the red if they took on. So plan A doesn't work. Plan B, I understand in the talks at the moment, is that the government would underwrite some big loans to these energy companies, and they would raise some money in the markets and use that to buy the gas that they would need to honour it. Now, that money would have to be paid back. It might be paid back over several years. Certainly it wouldn't happen all in one go, because it would be too much of a shock. So that is the possibility. The third one is you would have some kind of, if you like, quasi-nationalisation, where you have a special administrator, you take it into some kind of receivership, in that elsewhere in the corporate world. The big question I understand moment is that prices have risen 70% in August since the price cap was agreed for this year. And the big question is, does the price cap actually work? Obviously, it's good politics. The Conservatives adopted it from an Ed Miliband's suggestion, and they put it in. But it does mean that it creates a distortion in the market. And a lot of these smaller companies who've gone in trying to buy market share, offering great deals, have not been insured against a spike of this nature. And you can't have a cap and people who are unhedged at the same time. That doesn't work, and that's why we're seeing this fallout now.
Sorry.
No,
I was just going to ask, actually, the panel to respond to what you've just said about the energy cap, and I'll come straight back to you. Tom, should it stay or go, the energy cap?
I think it should stay. I think that we've got to keep a grip on energy prices that which have grown over a number of years, and I think it's the right thing to have it. But I think we do need to look at some of the energy companies often and the way they behave. And one of the concerns I have here is with smaller energy companies collapsing, a number of my constituents will be moved over to other companies, and it can be incredibly complicated and messy, these changeovers, and there's confusion over meter readings and everything else. And often letters are received by vulnerable constituents demanding thousands of pounds, often the wrong figure, by the way, and it can cause a huge amount of anxiety. So,
right.
you know, I think that we've got to also think about the way in which a lot of these energy companies communicate with often vulnerable members of the country.
Right. Should it stay or go, Daisy?
Absolutely needs to stay, but also it does need to be reformed because the price cap is still too high and doesn't protect enough of the vulnerable consumers. And if you think about poor pensioners, for example, pensioners living in poverty, if they get the Warm Homes discount, which is worth 140 quid, the increase in the price cap is £139. So it's going to get wiped out immediately. So we need to keep the cap, reform it to give greater protections to those on the lowest incomes. And then we need to get those stress tests built into the regulatory system so we don't have more of these companies collapsing in future.
Right. Well, Simon, you can see the political pressure then in terms of retaining the energy cap.
If the energy cap is going to stay, then companies that are offering deals need to insure themselves against spikes of this nature, because then they can't respond and put prices above the cap because they're capped. So I think, in a way, Ofgem has got some serious questions to answer about how it's allowed some of these new entrants in these smaller companies to make price promises to new customers to buy market share that in a situation like this they cannot deliver on, particularly when the cap is in place. So if the cap's there, you need to insure against these kind of issues, and Ofgem, as I say, has some serious questions to answer. Just in terms of the remedies, I should point out that the government is not suggesting that there will be government support to prop up failing companies. The government support will be in the form of, if you like, an incentive for the larger players to take on some of the people who've been abandoned when their existing companies go bust. So it's not a question of propping up the failures. It's a question of compensating the ones that have survived and have been more prudent for taking on loss-making customers.
All right. Obviously hear a bit more after that meeting that Kwasi Kwarteng is holding. Simon, Jack, thank you very much. Polly first and then Richard, do you think listening to what Simon has been saying in terms of the potential remedies to this situation, that it looks like customers and consumers are going to end up paying more?
Well, if prices are going up for the wholesale gas and energy, then in the end, one way or another, consumers will foot that bill. One of the things to always remember in this debate, actually, is that the UK has high energy bills, not because we have high energy prices, but because we don't insulate our homes very well. We're not as energy efficient. So if you want a long-term solution, that's actually the best place to go. Everybody has said that the price cap should stay. The price cap is bad policy making. It's actually better policy than what Ed Miliband had suggested. Simon suggested they were the same. Not the same. That was a price freeze, even worse. Because what it does is discourages switching, and actually it's the whole of this market needs to be reconceived to improve the protection for vulnerable consumers, but particularly around bringing their bills down through energy efficiency rather than prices, which actually could afford to go up if people were using less energy. And just Richard earlier suggested that if companies went bust, that would mean people didn't get their power. Just that's not the case. Supply continues whatever happens. And Ofgem do guarantee that.
Yeah, and they have guaranteed that, Richard. But just more broadly, what's your view on what you heard from Simon Jack there in terms of the potential remedies and the impact on consumers?
Well, I agree with him. I agree with, frankly, to sum up what everybody has said so far on this. Clearly, the price cap should stay. But we shouldn't forget, we're talking about basic GCSE economics here, When supply is high, prices are low. And when supply is low, prices are high. And caps in the world aren't going to gainsay that. That's the situation we're in at the moment. As I say, fundamental economics. And I think we just have to gird ourselves for price rises. It's going to happen.
Right. And we'll talk about the impact on people's constituents in just a moment. But Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat leader, was talking about this in his conference speech. Let's have a little listen to more of it.
Boris Johnson's Conservative government is steering us all into another terrible crisis. Shoppers greeted by empty shelves in the supermarket, house building materials stopped for lack of materials, pubs running dry, fears that there won't even be enough toys or turkeys for Christmas. It's enough to make you go and lie down, but we're even facing a shortage of mattresses. The reasons are clear. There aren't enough lorry drivers or enough people to work on our farms and provide our food. Not enough staff for our pubs, restaurants and hotels as they try to recover from the pandemic. from farms to factories, from an energy crisis to a food crisis. Thanks to the Conservatives, our country is hurtling towards a cliff edge, with a Prime Minister asleep at the wheel again.
That's the politics, obviously, from Ed Davey, Daisy, your leader. But do you agree that price rises in general are going to be necessary if we're going to wean ourselves off fossil fuels? I mean, while gas is cheap, there's no incentive to invest more in new technologies.
Well, when Ed Davey was the Climate and Energy Secretary in the coalition government, programme that invested heavily in renewables and almost quadrupled renewable energy in the UK. And as a result, the prices came down very quickly. So there is a role for government in terms of being an active government to stimulate a new market that then can bring those prices down.
Right. But would it be better if the prices go up, that more people focus on investing even more in those renewables that you're talking about?
For the most vulnerable people in our society right now, they can withstand additional prices for household bills or food or anything else. We are facing a cliff edge this autumn, and the government needs to step in to protect those people on the lowest income.
All right, well, Tom, let's talk about that and the constituents that you mentioned, because it's not just rising energy prices. Inflation is running at more than 3%. The government is increasing taxes with its national insurance hike, and now those on the lowest incomes are going to be losing the extra £20 a week to help them with their bills in the form of universal credit. I mean, how concerned are you that actually the biggest crisis for the government at the moment is a cost of living one?
I think there's a significant cost of living challenge over the next few months. I don't think anyone can deny that is the case. And
right.
I
and
think
is that the government's fault?
There are other reasons to be quite hopeful, and there's some encouraging signs from the economy. There are significant new vacancies. There are actually within my constituency as well. But, I'll be honest with you, we're going to have to make difficult decisions. We've already made some. We're going to have to make more. We've spent over £400 billion as a consequence of this pandemic. And anyone who says that there aren't difficult decisions we're going to have to make, they're not being honest with the electorate.
Right.
All we hear from the Big Party is, they're against decreasing international aid from 0.7 to 0.5. Well, that's 4.5 billion, or around 4 billion. They want to make this permanent. It's 6.5 billion. They'll say yes to every spending commitment under the sun, but with no plan of how to pay for it. So that is why the Labour Party, in my view, continue to have no credibility when it comes to the economy. But yes, there are difficult decisions that we're going to have to make, and we're going to have to continue to make them.
Right. Well, your colleague Damien Green, Conservative MP, actually thinks the government should also reconsider taking away one particular thing, and that's the £20 a week increase in universal credit from the poorest families in the UK. Why do you want them to reconsider it, Damien?
Because I think, and I've said this long before we started talking about a cost of living crisis, that as we come out of the pandemic, then the help that's been given to people, 40% of people who receive universal credit are in work, so they're already working hard, or people living on benefits. Those aren't the first people we should look for to try and restore the public finances. I agree with Tom that we have to do that, but I've never thought that this was the appropriate way to do it.
Is it one of the difficult decisions, though, that Tom is talking about, that the government has to make?
It is, and I absolutely agree that the government has to take difficult decisions. I voted in favour of the rise in national insurance because I think that's a sort of difficult decision that the government is right to take, and I applaud them for doing it. And I also think that the temporary suspension of the triple lock on pensions is reasonable. So I'm not behaving like one of the opposition parties. Both the opposition parties are being pretty irresponsible, spending places around without wanting to tax for them. But I do think that the universal credit cut at this moment, particularly in the context of what we've been talking about, the cost of living problems, it is very, very badly timed.
Right, but how many of your colleagues feel the same way?
I mean, various of them have expressed doubts about this, that they've either spoken or voted against it in the House of Commons. If you're asking me to predict what's going to happen later today, long experience tells me it's always foolish to do this. So the honest answer is I don't know.
Right. Tom, what do you think about what Damien's just said?
I've got great respect for Damien, and I sympathise with many of the points that he's made. I've already voted on difficult decisions we've had to make. I probably find the one on the 6 points on the universal credit more difficult than some of the other decisions I've had to make. But I think that, I've fed in my views But ultimately, it's the Chancellor, more than anybody else, and of course the Prime Minister, who have to sit there and deal with the fact that there are unprecedented pulls and pressures on the public purse, perhaps more so than there ever has been, following the 400-odd billion pounds being spent as a result of the pandemic. And ultimately, they're going to have to make that judgment call about what is affordable and what isn't affordable.
Right.
But, it is going to be a challenging time for many people in this country. And I think that is something we need to be acutely aware of. And if there are any other interventions that we can make to support people on low incomes across the country, and of course I'm keen for us to do that. But I will be supporting the government.
You will.
Today.
So you're not going to change your mind.
If there is a vote today, I will be supporting the government, and I'll be giving them my backing, because they're in a position at the moment where they've got a very difficult situation, and having to make very difficult decisions, and I'll be backing them. But I'm not, I do sympathise with some of the points made by Damien, who's a colleague I have great respect for, and I understand where he's coming from. But on this particular matter, we're not in agreement.
All right, Damien, I'll bring the others in. Thank you very much. Daisy, you were shaking your head, and I'll come to you, Richard, in just a moment. Go on, why?
I think Tom's constituents and lots of constituents of Conservative MPs will be shocked. He's saying that the government's got to make difficult choices, but look at the choices they're making. They're choosing to cut universal credit for some of the poorest people in the country. They're raising a national insurance tax, which is an unfair and unjust tax, as opposed to other tax rises they could bring in.
But the Liberal
instead.
Democrats also proposed to raise income tax.
So Liberal Democrats were very clear, and we had a fully costed proposal to raise a fair tax to support our health and social care. What the Conservatives are doing is choosing an unfair and unjust tax that will hit those on the lowest income the hardest.
I'll come back to you in just a second, Tom. Richard?
I just think this is fascinating, this whole conversation, because, I mean, we know that the last general election was basically about Brexit, and it was kind of about Corbyn as well, and the massive move to the left of the Labour Party back then, and they're still coming back from that. But to kind of paraphrase or to directly quote the Clinton sign that was above his desk, I think in his second bid for office, it's the economy, stupid. And I think what we're seeing here are the beginnings of what the debate's going to be about next time, and it's going to be about the economy. We are just beginning to see the rehearsals, and a bit later on down the line, the dress rehearsals for what the agenda of the next election is going to be, and it's going to be the economy. No question.
And what about those difficult decisions? Is there a fair way of doing it?
I don't think there ever is. It's always a compromise, and compromises mean that some people get more and others get less, and that's the nature of politics.
Tom?
There's a reality here with the Liberal Democrats, and that is that they can say absolutely everything they want to say in different parts of the country, because they're never going to be in power.
Well,
and they're never
they
going
were
to
in a coalition government, of course.
Decisions.
Right.
And that didn't end up very well for them, did it? Because they were forced to make decisions, and they lost a record number of seats. But as it is, the Liberal Democrat leader will say he's in favour of HS2. The candidate in Chesham will say something very different. They say one thing in one part of the country, something totally different in another part of the country. They're never going to be in government. They can say whatever they like. We are a party of government. The Conservative Party are elected to make often difficult decisions, and we will be doing that sadly over the next 2 or 3 years. There's no alternative to us doing that.
Shameful, you say, Polly?
Well, I think Richard's basically right that this cost of living question is going to be massively important over the coming months and potentially years. If you think about the macro politics here, the Conservatives have shifted their voters to include a lot more low-income people than they ever had voting for them before. And that's how they won that majority in 2019, including lots more northern places that tend to have economies more dependent on state spending. So if they want to hold that coalition together, they may need to get better at listening to concerns from, lower income people around cost of living pressures, because most people, except for the wonderful viewers of this programme, don't pay much attention to politics, but the cost of living is something that affects you viscerally every single day. And if you think of fuel duty controversies and like road blockades or council tax crises and people refusing to pay, it is that kind of pound in your pocket politics which I think is so visceral, so important to people, and we don't really have an agenda for it beyond job creation. But of course, that doesn't help low-income pensioners. It doesn't help low-income disabled people. And the Conservatives are going to have to find a way to listen to those views if they want to hold on that election-winning coalition.
As we enter party conference season, of course, with the Liberal Democrats moving on to Labour and the Conservatives fairly shortly, the Canterbury MP, the Labour MP Rosie Duffield, says she won't be attending the Labour Party conference because of threats against her. Let's have a look at this headline in the Sunday Times. Speakers anger, that's Lindsay Hoyle, as extremists terrorise Labour MP Rosie Duffield. Threats after feminist branded transphobic. Rosie Duffield explained her decision this morning. This is what she had to say.
I took the decision a few weeks ago not to go. I didn't want to be the centre of attention. It's hard to know how serious to take threats by people who post them online. You know, I don't always very often take them that seriously, actually, but they're pretty awful. And I did not want to subject myself and other people to that kind of abuse. I'm not imagining they're necessarily going to physically harm me, but, you know, the kind of levels of vitriol and, you know, it's pretty horrible. And, you know, I don't feel that I wanted to go through that, to be honest.
Rosie Duffield stating her position there and her decision not to attend the conference. Now, she's drawn criticism from the trans community for tweets that she has liked, including one last year where she liked a tweet in which Piers Morgan took issue with a CNN headline that featured the line "individuals with a cervix," to which he wrote, "Do you mean women?" Daisy, is it a problem that Rosie Duffield liked a tweet like that? Is it transphobic?
I think it's a huge problem that Rosie Duffield is experiencing this horrible vitriol and this hate, which is silencing her as a woman in public office. We have got to get the toxicity out of these kind of culture war debates. We have got to start being able to find a way to debate tricky issues in a way that is respectful and inclusive. And it's very difficult to find time and space on the media and outside of the media to be able to do that.
Well, I'm giving you a little bit of time and space, and we have discussed these issues. But do you think the fact that she liked that tweet by Piers Morgan about individuals with a cervix, to which he wrote, "Do you mean women?" She liked it. She says she got some abuse from the trans community. Is it a transphobic tweet that she liked?
So I would have a problem with that particular tweet. The fact is, I have no problem with the word woman. I think I describe myself as a woman. Lots of people describe themselves as women. Nobody's trying to get rid of the word woman. But there are situations, particularly medical situations, where in medical settings, people do want to have a different descriptor. So in public discourse, people are very happy to call themselves men and women. That's not a problem. No one's trying to erase that language. But in medical settings, there is a different language that sometimes has to be used for those medical reasons. And I think that this suggestion that somehow people who are using those medical terminology are trying to erase other language is unhelpful. And it stirs up this hate and vitriol towards trans people who are statistically very vulnerable and more likely to suffer from mental ill health and suicidal thoughts. And we've got to make sure that in all these debates we remember that at the centre of these debates are people's lives, and often very vulnerable people who are suffering as a result.
I honestly think that what's happened here is an absolute disgrace. And I think the fact that this woman can't go to her party conference because of the threats and the abuse she's getting online is absolutely unacceptable. And I don't see why we have to put up with it. It's perfectly possible to track people who use online social media platforms to abuse others. You can track them down. You can find their IP address. I'm actually writing a novel about it at the moment, so I've done a bit of research into it. It's not that difficult. It takes a bit of time, but you can find out where they live. And if they've issued threats, and if they've abused somebody in any way, shape or form, you can go after them under criminal law. And that's what we should be doing. That woman should be at her party conference. It's disgusting that she feels she has to basically stay behind the curtains at home. I find it extraordinary that in this day and age we've been reduced to this.
Right, well, let me just show you this tweet from my colleague, correspondent Ione Wells, where she says a senior Labour MP has told the BBC she's frustrated with the oxygen that the row over Rosie Duffield's views on transgender issues was getting. She added, it's all the same arguments as the gay panic in the 80s rehashed. Polly, your response to that?
I'm afraid I don't remember much about the 80s gay panic. But I certainly think that there is a way in which the debate about trans rights has become extraordinarily toxic and unhelpful, and people aren't able to listen to or tolerate different views. I also think it's a really troubling fact about the Labour Party in particular. I remember running into Luciana Berger at the Liberal Democrat conference after she and other Labour MPs had left the Labour Party and in the end joined the Liberal Democrats. And she said it was like a weight off her shoulders being there among people who liked her. And if somebody came up to speak to her in the corridor, it was because they wanted to say, hello, lovely to meet you, instead of to have a go at her. And I think the Labour Party does seem, and I know it's perhaps unfair to criticise them when there's no Labour Party representative here.
Yes.
But my experience going to Labour conference and Conservative conference is as an outsider who doesn't belong to either of those parties, doesn't belong to any party, of feeling much more listened to and welcomed among Conservatives than among the Labour Party. And if they want to win power again, they need to much more broadly find a way to listen to and find a space for, even a safe space for, people whose views don't accord with party orthodoxy.
Right. Well, as you say, you're talking about Labour. They're not here. We did ask Labour and LGBT plus Labour to come onto the programme, but they didn't get back to us, just to state that at this point. Let me just read you a little bit more, actually, following on from the tweet I read just a few moments ago by the senior Labour MP who said that she's frustrated with the oxygen being given to Rosie Duffield's views, Tom. It says, let's talk about how every single trans person awaiting NHS treatment is having their rights to see a specialist in 18 weeks under the NHS constitution breached, for example, rather than whether Rosie Duffield thinks everyone should have their genitals and chromosomes checked to go to the toilet. Do you sympathise?
I think, that Labour MP in question may find it very, very frustrating that there is a legitimate debate about why there's a pattern over the last few years, why a number of high-profile female politicians and journalists feel uncomfortable at the Labour Party conference, so uncomfortable that they either don't go or they have a security intel with them. That is a serious question the Labour Party have to answer, and Keir Starmer has been pretty silent on this. And you know what? I kind of understand why.
All right.
He's going to be forced to come down on one side or the other.
All right. Well, he's not here. I'd love him to come onto the programme, of course, Keir Starmer, whenever he's free. Let's move on to a party that is here, represented by Daisy, because it is an issue for your party too. Natalie Bird, a former Liberal Democrat activist, has been banned from standing as a Liberal Democrat in any circumstances for 10 years because she wore a T-shirt with the slogan, woman, adult, human, female. Do you have an issue with the phrase woman, adult, human, female?
Well, that phrase in particular doesn't include trans women, of course. But I know nothing about that complaint because we have an independent complaints process within the Liberal Democrats, which MPs are not involved in and are not consulted in.
Yeah, but is it right? Is it right, that decision that's been made?
Well, without seeing all of the details of the complaints and the process, it would be impossible for me to say. But what I would say is that every time the Liberal Democrats are challenged on our position, we're very happy to say what our position is. We've said time and time again that we believe that trans rights are human rights, and that is our position. And I think it's important that the other political parties state their views, and that the Conservative Party actually does have questions to answer about why it's using a culture war unit in Number 10 to try and stir up these kind of polarised debates.
Decision you support?
As I say, I haven't seen all of the details of the complaint. I haven't seen all of the details of the judgment. There may well have been more or less information that was relevant to that case. Without seeing it, I'm not in a position to say. It's an independent complaints process.
Well, if you stick your hand in the fire, you're going to get burned. And the whole transgen debate over the last 2 or 3 years has become white hot. And speaking as a newspaper columnist, and I do a couple of columns, I count to 10 every time I decide to write something on this issue, because it is so easy to cause offence, it's so easy to get it wrong. And I think wearing a T-shirt like that, to me, that isn't the crime of the century, but you're sort of asking for trouble. I think we've got to... I do remember the debate over gay rights of the 1980s, and what I remember is that there was a lot of reactionary thinking at the time, and looking back on it, some of the things which people said which seemed reasonable at the time weren't at all, and they were unacceptable. And I think we just need, all of us, to calm down a lot about transgender, step back from it and think carefully before we speak, wear a T-shirt, send a tweet.
Right, well, I mean, that's an important point, isn't it, Tom, in terms of whether people are actually fuelling the debate. Daisy has accused the Conservatives of pushing a culture war with its Number 10 unit. It's true, isn't it?
If Number 10 is setting up a unit in Number 10 to try and push back on some of the nonsense we've seen over the last few years, and to try and push back against some of the wokeification of key national charities and institutions, then I'd very much welcome that. I don't think that unit would have anything to do with, it wouldn't have, I can categorically say it wouldn't have anything to do with stirring up debates about transphobia. That's absolutely not the case, and that is an allegation with no merit or foundation whatsoever. In terms of this T-shirt worn by the Liberal Democrat, I believe she was a parliamentary candidate and now not. I don't know if I'm missing something. I don't see anything particularly offensive about what that message says on the T-shirt. It doesn't say anything anti any group. It just says probably what that person is and how they identify. I don't see a problem with that. And again, I really think the Liberal Democrats should consider whether the word liberal should be in their name, because they don't seem to be very liberal for me. They weren't on Brexit when they sought to repeal the Brexit result without even a further referendum. They're not a Liberal Party. They're anti-free speech.
Daisy?
We are a party that has embraced and defends free speech. It's in our veins. And I think it's a bit rich coming from a Conservative party that's trying to crack down on peaceful protest and take away the right of every individual to take the government to court when when the government fails them. So I think it's a bit rich coming from a Conservative on that point.
All right, we're going to move on. I just want you to listen to this from the former US President George Bush. He was speaking and giving a speech on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Let's have a listen.
In the weeks and months following the 9/11 attacks, I was proud to lead an amazing, resilient, united people. When it comes to the unity of America, those days seem distant from our own. Malign force seems at work in our common life that turns every disagreement into an argument, and every argument into a clash of cultures.
George Bush there. Well, we're joined by Evan Osnos, a staff writer at The New Yorker. Welcome to you, Evan. You've written a new book, Wildland, The Making of America's Fury. Did you agree with what George Bush said?
I suppose I have to surprise myself by saying I did, and I think there are a lot of people who didn't imagine that George W. Bush would have been the person to diagnose our political problems at the moment. But the truth is, he is right. There is a way in which Donald Trump's generation of Republicans inhabit, as the former president said, the same foul spirit of, in effect, intolerance, of excluding people from politics, of imagining that we can eliminate our opponents. And it's a grim measure of where we are now, 20 years after 9/11. Just to give you one data point, 79% of Republicans recently told a CNN poll that they believe that Joe Biden did not actually win the election. This is a higher number even than shortly after the January 6th insurrection. So the problem, I'm afraid, is getting worse, not better.
Right. One of the issues which comes up in your book is Afghanistan. Last time we talked to you and you joined the show, it was to discuss your biography of Joe Biden. Has the withdrawal demonstrated that Joe Biden is really another American first president?
Well, I think it is clearly an example in which he was not deterred by the serious concerns of American allies. He has a very different approach in a lot of ways from Donald Trump. But it's clear that on this matter, and I think people who were involved in the briefings and the decision making around Afghanistan agree, that he was really more or less undeterrable. He had wanted for years to get out of Afghanistan. One of the things I describe in the book is the way in which the war in Afghanistan visited twice as many casualties on small towns and cities in America as it did on big cities. In his view, he was the first parent of a child to serve in combat, a first president to have a child who served in combat since the Carter administration. So he comes at this from a personal element. And in the end, it, of course, made a lot of very unhappy American partners and people at home who thought that the withdrawal was done so poorly.
And what about you? Are you disappointed?
Well, I'm not sure that it's up to me to decide whether I'm disappointed or not. Look, the point, I think it was pretty ugly, the way it went. And there's no question that there were decisions now that people would go back and do differently to try to avoid the misery, really, that befell the Afghans in that moment. And at the same time, the idea of embarking on a third decade in Afghanistan would be a failure of political will. I mean, part of the reason why the United States found itself with so much accumulated trouble there was because previous presidents had not made hard choices to get the United States out.
Richard?
Well,
I can speak from the politics of the personal here, really. My mother was Canadian and we had a lot of American family, and I've always been incredibly pro-American, and it breaks my heart to see what's happened to the United States of America. And obviously what happened on 9/11 was the beginning of this terrible divide and split. But I do think that there's one other factor that we're not taking into account here in the toxicity of what's happened in America, and that's social media and the ability for almost anybody to spout any kind of conspiracy theory, loony theory out there, put it out there and develop a head of steam. And I think that is actually a powerful aspect of what's happened to America and what we've seen in the last couple of years.
Evan?
Right. I mean, look, I describe in the book the ways in which social media allows people to, in effect, liberate themselves from community of any substantive real kind. And that's a disastrous result. They're no longer connected to their neighbors. They no longer see people in their area as being part of their lives. They can sort of upload themselves to these nationalized political identities, which have a way of spinning off into greater and greater lunacy. And you see it today around the vaccine. The simple fact is you have Americans in large numbers turning away from a free, life-saving vaccine because they are inhabiting these worlds in which science is suspect and no institution is worth trusting.
All right, I just want to bring us right up to date, because over the last few days, a massive diplomatic row, as you'll all know, has broken out with the French after the US, the UK and Australia signed a new security deal known catchily as AUKUS. The agreement brokered last week was widely interpreted as an attempt to try to counter China's influence in the South China Sea. French politicians very upset. Let's just show you this response from the French Europe Minister, Clement Beaune. Our British friends explained to us they were leaving the EU to create global Britain. We can see that this is a return into the American lap and a form of accepted vassalisation. Evan, is he right? I mean, how do you view post-Brexit Britain?
Well, I'd say actually at the moment, this decision that we're talking about was really primarily viewed in the United States through the lens of this long-range question of dealing with China. There's no question there were going to be problems. The French reaction is something the United States is going to be digging out of for a while. But the issue that the U.S. is thinking about over the course of decades, ultimately the century to come, is what is our role in the Pacific? And what role should we expect Australia and other allies to have? And this was a decision that I think they were in effect willing to take the short-term hit in order to have a long-term change in the policy.
Right. I mean, you can hardly blame the French, can you, Tom, when you read quotes like that from France's Europe Minister?
I think that a number of the French politicians have actually acted in an incredibly childish way with regards to this particular partnership. You know, I think it's to do very, to South China Sea, very, we formed a very close partnership with two of our arguably our closest allies, and I think that's to be welcomed. I don't think there's. Can I just make a quick point about this book? I mean, I do think there's been other times in American political history post-war where, I remember reading a book called Nixonland, which was about how hot public discourse got in the States in the late 60s, early 70s. This does seem to happen from time to time, and I think anyone who comes to any firm conclusions about the United States at this particular moment in time and says, "Oh, it's on the way out," things can turn around quite quickly. And I think the person who writes off the United States of America, I would advise that person not to do that. I think it's a great country, and I think it remains a great. Things will ebb and flow. Special relationship will ebb and flow, but ultimately, they remain our closest allies, and I'm very proud to say that. And I'm incredibly pro-American.
Evan?
No, I'm pleased to hear it. Look, actually, the truth is I tend to agree. As a matter of fact, the idea that there is a pendulum effect in American politics is only clearer to me after spending the last 6 years talking to people. What I mean by that is, at the very moment that we are talking about this inferno of cynicism and political delusion in some parts of American politics, there is also this very real sense in some places that it's up to us. Honestly, if we're going to try to fix this, we can't rely on some of the same politicians who led us into this mess to take us out. And I've just encountered some kind of thrilling examples in various places. So that does give me real confidence that we do have a way of climbing our way out.
Evan Osnos, thank you very much. Polly, your response. You can respond to anything that's
so many. I think it's that depolarization process that fascinates me. I don't think we're in the same situation in the UK as we are in the US, but but partly because of the dynamics Richard describes around social media, to do with technology and the personalization of our economics as well. But lots of forces that are fragmenting us and pulling us apart, making it harder to build